for an ecological deployment of offshore winds in Europe. This is a webinar organized by the Renewables Grid Initiative. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Cristina Signoli. I'm the program manager of the offshore nature and energy activities at the Renewables Grid Initiative. We have to share with you some rules for our discussion today. So please keep your mute button, mute yourself while you're not speaking. We will use a video after the presentation from the expert, so that in order to have a participatory discussion, we will ask you to actually put your video on. For the discussion afterwards, please raise your hand to ask a question or write it in the chat. We would like to limit the question in the chat so that we would like you actually to be active, and I will pass you the floor once I see your hands raised. So in order to start, let me share some information about the Renewables Grid Initiative for those of you who are not familiar with our association. We are a European association based in Berlin. We have a quite unique membership structure, which consists of a combination of transmission system operators and the NGOs, who have decided now more than 12 years ago to work together to enable the growth of renewables and also to enable the energy system of the future. In 2021, shortly before the publication of the European Offshore Renewable Strategy by the European Commission, we have launched an initiative dedicated to offshore developments. So this is the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, bringing together environmental and climate NGOs, transmission system operators, and also wind developers, so industry involved in the wind sector. Those members that today arrived at the number of 26 are collaborating in order to enable the sustainable deployment of the offshore wind energy and the grid infrastructure, while ensuring alignment with nature protection and healthy marine ecosystem. Therefore, we do strongly believe that the climate and the biodiversity crisis need to be tackled together, and together we are looking into different aspects of the marine environment in order to allow this increasing infrastructure development, and we are committed to find joint solutions. Let me give you a little bit of a context to this webinar today. So we are already very familiar with the term acceleration. So even before the war in Ukraine started, actually the acceleration of renewables and the connecting grid, so the two concepts of renewables and grid deployment was already in the political agenda. But of course, what happened, so that the current geopolitical situation has given even a more urgent character to this need, so the need to accelerate. We have proposals for increasing the renewables energy target from 40 to 45%, and we have a Repower EU plan that actually calls for the acceleration of renewables and grid in order actually to become energy independent. The Repower plan also had foreseen the removal of the bottlenecks that actually today are delaying the infrastructure development needed for renewables and grid, so that acceleration is at the center of the debate. At the same time, also nature degradation and biodiversity loss are at the center of the debate. So there is the Biodiversity Strategy by 2030 that actually have targets that are still unattended, and there is more recently on the 22nd of June, the release of the proposal for the nature restoration law, where actually 80% of the European habitats are in poor condition. This is a statement, so that we need, of course, to accelerate, because this is a need, but at the same time, we do need to take into consideration the biodiversity crisis that we are living. And therefore, there is a need to combine the energy planning along with actually the nature planning, and particularly the restoration planning. So this is to introduce to you actually the topics that we are addressing today, because in this context of need to accelerate, it is clear that the infrastructure that we will need to build will need to be an ecologically sound infrastructure. And when it comes to bring together diverse groups of stakeholders, like we do in the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, there is a need to create a common understanding of the key challenges, but also there is a need to actually understand some of the key concepts. This is why, with great pleasure, now I'm introducing to you the expert that actually today will walk us through the discussion paper that has started in the ocean and has been then revised and concluded by Dr. PJ Stephenson. PJ is an independent conservation and sustainability consultant. He's the chair of the IUCN CCS Species Monitoring Specialist Group, and is also researcher at the researcher fellow at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Before publishing this discussion paper, I have to mention that actually PJ already collaborated with RGI and the ocean last year when we published the review of biodiversity data needs and monitoring protocols for the offshore wind energy sector in the Baltic Sea and North Sea. And there is a connection actually between the two. So this review study and the paper that now PJ will walk us through. So it is my pleasure, PJ, to pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Christina. Let me just share my screen. Can you just confirm you're seeing that? Yep.
Yes, we do. Please.
Good. Great. Well, thank you very much, Christina, and thank you very much to you and the Renewables Grid Initiative for both inviting me to do this brief study, but also then to present it to your various partners. As Christina explained, essentially, what I'm going to present today is a brief overview of the discussion paper that I produced. I want to just sort of highlight at the beginning, this was a rapid assessment. This was a rapid overview of the concepts. Each one could warrant a huge report in its own right. The idea was very much to give people a snapshot, a quick overview of what are these concepts about, precisely then what is the relevance to the offshore wind sector, and then trying to tease apart some of the issues that need to be considered as we take this forward. So kind of related to Christina's intro, but I guess because you're on the call, you already understand most of the issues, but it's worth highlighting again now why we're doing this. Of course, offshore wind energy offers an enormous opportunity for the world to move in a significant direction towards increasing the proportion of our energy that we generate from sustainable sources. And of course, Europe is very much the global hub for the development of this source of energy and for the technologies associated with it. But of course, like a lot of things in this world, there are two sides to it. And unfortunately, although it's a great source of renewable energy, the structures around offshore wind can themselves cause some impacts on the environment. So of course, what we need to ensure is that this great opportunity to reduce emissions and improve our climate doesn't at the same time adversely impact biodiversity. And so that's why we need to find ways to make the energy source, its generation itself, as sustainable and as environmentally friendly as possible. And that's very much why RGI and its partners in the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature got together and decided what are the current environmental concepts that are the most relevant to offshore wind. And so along with these partners, we've come up with 16 concepts that we think are probably the most relevant. Just to go through them so you're clear, there's conservation, critical habitat, ecological opportunity, ecological risk, ecosystem approach or the ecosystem-based approach, ecosystem restoration, ecosystem services, good environmental status, the mitigation hierarchy, nature-based solutions, nature inclusive design, nature positive, the precautionary principle, pressures and impacts, and that includes cumulative impacts, the seascapes approach, and sustainability. Now that's quite a mixed bag. I mean, I'm sure many of you on the call will have at least heard of these, but you're probably more familiar with some than others. And so, as I said, what I did then was basically look at each of these in turn to just try and get a quick overview of what they mean and what they mean for this sector. The first thing to note is there's a lot of overlap. What this table is here, this is taken directly from the report, but what it shows in the left-hand column is the concepts I just mentioned. And on the right, each time there's a box ticked, that means that concept had a clear relationship with another concept. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of overlap and synergy, which is of course a good thing. And some are very more closely tied together than others. So what we thought today for this presentation is, obviously, rather than me go through the whole report, which you can read at your own leisure anyway, is we would just pick some of these closely related concepts and just talk a little bit about them. So what we've chosen here is the ecosystem approach, or the ecosystem-based approach, and cumulative impacts. I'll also look at ecosystem restoration, along with the mitigation hierarchy and nature positive. We'll also look at nature-based solutions and nature-inclusive design. And then, although one on its own, we just thought the precautionary principle, given its sort of overarching nature, we would also touch on as well. Okay, so in that light then, let me just take you through some of these related concepts. So cumulative impacts. What do we mean by that? Well, if we look at the EU's definition, it's about environmental effects caused by the combined actions of past, current, and future activities. Now, I'll just say here perhaps that for the sake of this presentation, I'm taking one definition and really boiling it down to a simple sentence, but you'll see from the report that for each case, I laid out what the most currently sort of commonly applied definition is for each of these approaches. Although what you'll also see from the report is there's often not a lot of agreement. But for my presentation today, I'm just going to give you a sort of one-line summary of one of the top-line definitions for each. So here, from the EU's perspective, then cumulative impacts, it's effects caused by combined actions, human actions. And what we mean then in the context of the offshore wind sector. So many of you will be familiar with the environmental impacts that offshore wind can have. This is a graphic taken from Leon Bennon's work with colleagues at the Biodiversity Consultancy and IUCN. And here they identified 14 main categories of impacts on the environment. And that can range from the noise generated by construction activity or boats to collisions of birds and bats, either with power cables or with the turbines themselves. So you've got a range of different impacts. But of course, if you put one wind farm next to another, you've got additional impacts. So that is one way when we're talking about cumulative impacts. That is one aspect of that. It's accumulating more impacts from the same source. So you have a few turbines, you add more, you're getting a cumulative impact of multiple farms. But then the other angle to this is cumulative impacts is other human uses for the same piece of ocean. And so, of course, there's a lot of other uses going on, human activities, whether it's energy or shipping or fisheries. And again, so cumulative impacts also refers to this aggregation of all of these different human activities. And this graphic here that I replicated in the report comes from the commission responsible for the environment in the Baltic. And as you can see, it's quite a great illustration of how different human activities cause different pressures on the environment, and several of them all add up to the fact that we've got a massive cumulative impact on the environment. And what we can see is that, in fact, 93% of Europe's marine area faces multiple pressures. And it's felt that the combined effect of these multiple pressures on marine species and habitats reduces the overall resilience of the marine ecosystem. So it basically the bigger the cumulative impacts, the less able the ecosystem is going to be able to recover from that. Now, there are systems available for assessing cumulative effects, and therefore assessing cumulative impact is a requirement of the EU's Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Methods are available for cumulative impact assessments, but there are different views on how to do it. It's not terribly standardized. And overall, what I gained from this review is a real understanding that for cumulative, we don't understand enough yet about what cumulative impacts of offshore wind mean for the environment. So we need more studies into this, and we need the sharing of data and experiences from different wind farms, from different actors in the sector to really better understand the cumulative impacts that we're having. Okay, so the ecosystem or ecosystem-based approach. So here I'm going to take a snapshot, the definition from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which says that it is the integrated management of land, water, and living resources that promotes conservation and sustainable use. Now again, this has been taken on board in Europe by the European Union, and the ecosystem approach is a key requirement of marine spatial planning, as per the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the later Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. And in these instances, ecosystem-based approach considers the cumulative impacts of different sectors on the marine environment. So that's where you've got the approach and the impacts there. They're inherently linked here because you need to take account of cumulative impacts in order to use the ecosystem approach. But there are challenges for this. One paper that I talk about in my report notes that looking at 12 case studies, there are issues with use of the ecosystem approach in spatial planning. There tends to be a lack of standardization. People talk about human pressures in different ways. There aren't really a use of frameworks to assess ecosystem services. So you may look at ecosystems, but not their benefits to people. And the implementation of the precautionary and adaptive management approaches are also not dealt with across these case studies. So overall on this approach, there is a continuing discussion on definitions and implementation, and especially how that relates to ecosystem services. And I would just flag here that a key link between these two then is we still don't completely understand all of the elements of cumulative impacts or how the ecosystem approach works in the marine context. And we're also not yet there in having standardized ways of looking at these across the sector as well. Okay, so now let me go on to this other collection of related issues. Here we're talking about ecosystem restoration, mitigation hierarchy, and nature positive. So ecosystem restoration, again, looking to the Convention on Biological Diversity for the summary definition. This is about managing or assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed to sustain ecosystem resilience and to conserve biodiversity. Nature positive, you might have heard this a lot, but it might still be unfamiliar to some of you. But this is a broad term for halting and reversing nature loss. And it's often used in the context of a nature positive goal, which has been proposed, which tries to say that we should have a global aspiration to turn around, reverse nature loss by 2030. Obviously, the key link there with ecosystem restoration is we're not going to be able to reverse the loss of biodiversity unless we restore biodiversity as well. So there's a clear link there. The mitigation hierarchy has been out there for a bit longer, so probably more familiar to more of you. This is a framework around 4 key actions to aid in the sustainable management of natural resources to try and balance conservation needs with development priorities. Now, as many of you know, restore is one of the 4 actions, so there's already a clear link to ecosystem restoration. But also it is a means by which companies can strive for goals around no net loss or also net gain. And I think we're going to need companies to strive for net gain if we're going to reach this nature positive goal. So there's a clear link there as well with nature positive. So just to give you a sort of graphic representation of this relationship, this is a graphic on the mitigation hierarchy. And just to point out, so on the left, that loud pinky purpley column is the potential impact that an activity might have on the environment. So that might be installing turbines in an ocean. And the first part of the hierarchy is to try and avoid that impact. So that might be, if we build the turbine here, we're going to destroy a reef. So we'll avoid that by moving somewhere else and avoiding that sensitive habitat. The second step is to minimize the impact. So this might be, if you can't avoid the impact, it might be changing the way you do it. So it might be using different technologies, different project design that minimizes the impact on the environment. And then the third step in the hierarchy is restore. So if your work, if your development does end up causing damage to the environment, that there is an effort made to restore the damage that's done. And then last but not least, there is offset. And many of you will have heard of biodiversity offsets. And this is very much about, if you cannot even restore where you are, then it is about investing in conservation or restoration somewhere else. So while you may damage the environment in one place, you offset that damage by helping the environment somewhere else. And as you can see, restore is a key component of this. And basically, if you use different elements of the mitigation hierarchy, it can help companies reach basically no net loss. So it can make sure you mitigate all of your predicted impacts, but you can then take additional actions. I'm going the wrong way. You can take additional actions, which might be additional conservation work, additional restoration work, to actually lead to a net gain, which means that nature is in a better state than it was before you started your activities. And of course, this sort of approach is going to be absolutely crucial if we're going to work towards nature positive and turn around some of the key trends that we are seeing. I think the key point to mention here, which I'll come back to though, but one of the challenges here, of course, is monitoring delivery. It's all very well having these high aspirations for how you're going to mitigate your impact or try and achieve nature positive, but you're going to have to deliver that. And I had literally just yesterday, somebody from the sustainability team in a large multinational company asked me just that question. So we'd like to go for no net loss or net gain, but the idea of how we measure that is a challenge. And I think going forward, especially for the marine sector, that is something that needs to be thought about. So just a few more comments on ecosystem restoration. This is relatively new. I think a lot of our experience of restoration comes from terrestrial environments. And I think as we start to apply it more to marine systems, we need to learn lessons from terrestrial systems. Defining and predicting ecological success in the marine context is a challenge. Of course, I think this goes back to a lot of environmental issues in oceans and coasts. When you come to dealing with biodiversity underwater, almost by default, it gets trickier to deal with than anything on land. But trying to work out, therefore, what success looks like and how you go about that is still, our understanding of that can be tricky. But it is also clear as well, how successful this approach can be does depend a bit on what sort of ecosystem or site or techniques you're talking about. And the effort involved also changes. So, if you get to the stage you are trying to restore a coral ecosystem or some seagrass beds, then that will generally take you longer than many other marine or coastal environments. And I think I'd just like to end by saying that restoration is talked about a lot now, but it should still be the last resort. It's still better to start with that first step of the mitigation hierarchy and avoid damage in the first place. Protecting nature is still the best option, and in fact, the most cost-effective, because trying to restore it later is not only difficult, but it is expensive. And so let's just keep that in mind, that wherever we can, whereas restoration can be a solution, we should still always think of trying to avoid the damage in the first place. And again, I think Christina showed it in her opening slide there, but I think, again, restoration is now becoming even more relevant. Many of you will have seen last week the proposed EU nature restoration law, which I think is also going to raise the profile of restoration work as well. And again, just the last couple of points on the mitigation hierarchy, again, a bit like restoration, largely tested on land in terrestrial systems, increasingly used in marine systems, but not as widely yet. I think it definitely is a useful framework to plan biodiversity actions, mitigation measures around wind farms. But again, keep in mind my point that we're still better off with the avoid part of the hierarchy. And I think the more we move towards nature positive, the less we're going to see offsets becoming a viable or credible option. I think people are going to say, okay, destroying the environment somewhere and then just saying, yeah, but I helped somewhere else, I honestly think is going to become less and less seen as a viable option. And I think, again, going back, restoration is going to be key in offshore wind farms if they're close to important natural habitats where at least some damage wasn't avoided. But I think it's also going to be a very important part of decommissioning. And remember, we're talking about a relatively new technology here now with offshore wind. We've only seen some of the earliest wind farms now starting to get into the stage of decommissioning. It's something we need to learn more about. And of course, what happens in decommissioning varies a bit depending on the national law. But I think restoration is also going to be a key there. And so we need to factor that in. And then just nature positive. Again, I mean, this is a term you're hearing a lot. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development has flagged the fact that this really is starting to become a rallying term or a beacon to guide to how to transform action across all sectors of society, including business. And as I say, I think because of that, a move towards net gain ambitions like nature positive are going to probably take over more and gain more momentum than no net loss in the future as well. I think the degree to which European countries in general and the offshore wind sector in particular are going to aim collectively for net gain will influence, though, a bit the extent to which net positive is embraced for marine environments in Europe. Okay, so my last set of linked concepts is nature-based solutions and nature-inclusive design. So nature-based solutions are really actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems that provide both human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And they're very much set up in the context of tackling societal challenges, as they put it. So societal challenges can be about food security, it can be about habitat degradation, but water supplies, whatever the main societal challenge is, but that is a key element. So the human dimension is seen as important as the biodiversity angle. Nature inclusive design, on the other hand, that's basically about options that are integrated in or added to the design of human structures to enhance ecological functioning. So the first is very much about trying to manage and restore ecosystems. The second one is trying to make sure that what humans are putting in the environment is as nature friendly as possible. So nature-based solutions, the International Union for Conservation of Nature has produced a standard and a set of guidelines on applying nature-based solutions, which is very much a key element now in how we go about applying them. And in these documents, they provide some examples of where that works in the marine environment. Again, there's a lot more going on land, but there are examples in the marine environment, such as climate change risk mitigation initiatives, such as beach nourishment or beach filling, and also reef and mangrove revivals. And also the creation of reef substrate on offshore wind farm foundations to enhance the settlement of organisms while at the same time reducing scouring. But there are challenges. This is still a relatively new concept. The guidelines, the standard itself dates from only 2020. The term is being used a lot, and I hear it a lot, but I think probably in the majority of cases, people aren't necessarily referring into it in the true IUCN definition. So people are just often using the term when they just mean something they're doing that benefits nature. But I think that is a bit of a challenge. Because then it's not really clear. Are you talking about real nature-based solutions or just something that you think is nature-friendly? Also, sometimes it's not always clear what is nature and what is natural. And also, application of this this approach is a challenge because it requires a really good understanding of the ecosystem, which is not always the case in marine environments. You need to engage a diverse selection of key actors and stakeholders, and you really need to, as I said, integrate a broad range of societal challenges into these nature-based solutions as well. And so that means a lot of working with people, a lot of accessing and understanding of the environment you're talking about as well. Nature inclusive design. So as I mentioned this, I mean, certainly in the offshore context, I think this is about the construction phase, essentially in offshore wind. It's about turbine foundations, as we just heard an example. It's also about offshore substations, scour protection layers, and how cables are protected as well. And it's often, I think in this context, about the substrates that are used and how they're adapted to encourage the settlement or the shelter of different sea life. Again, there are challenges. They're supposed to be nature friendly, but there's always a risk of structural failure or that it will lead to some sort of biofouling or invasive alien species come in and settle there. There is also, apparently from what I reviewed, a bit of confusion about how nature inclusive design relates to restoration in the context of marine spatial planning. And I think this goes back to my earlier definitions, but I think here it's worth remembering that nature inclusive design is about human structures added to the sea and making them more nature friendly. Restoration is about recovering damaged and restoring damaged natural ecosystems. And so they're not by any means the same thing. But if we go back to the two that we paired together here about nature inclusive design and nature-based solutions, well, essentially you could say nature inclusive design in some cases can be a type of nature-based solution. It's a solution you're applying. It can help lead to both environmental and human benefits, but it's only ever going to be a nature-based solution if it does follow the standards. So it means it does need to address a specific challenge. It does need to lead to a resultant net gain in biodiversity. Last but not least, and so I don't talk for too long and we can have a bit of a discussion on this, but let me just finish then on the precautionary principle or the precautionary approach. This helps decision-making when the possibility of harm has not been established scientifically. And basically, I think we're all clear on this. It's quite an easy one to get your head around. And it basically means if you're going to do something in the marine environment, but if you're not sure of the environmental impact you're going to have, then don't do it. And that's kind of, in brief, what this is about. And the CBD have basically made it very clear that in order for the world to deliver biodiversity targets, decision-making needs to encapsulate the precautionary approach as well as sound science. And again, going back to the context we're operating and talking about today, the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive also states that measures to maintain good environmental status should be devised on the basis of the precautionary principle. So again, if you're not sure it's going to do harm, then avoid it. The challenge in this is the lack of understanding of many offshore wind pressures and cumulative impacts, as I've mentioned already. This makes it even more important that we use it. But the problem is, given our uncertainty about so many of these impacts, the risk is we're going to be using it too much and possibly even being too cautious. And I think the key, therefore, is if we do more research and better monitoring of what's going on, if we can get a better understanding of those cumulative impacts and better understand how well ecosystem restoration is working, then we'll be able to use the precautionary principle, yes, but less. Keep it in reserve for where we really don't understand. Okay, so there you go. That was a sort of what we say a whistle-stop tour of some of the concepts. I'd encourage you to read the reports if you want to see more and also get the sources of some of my information there too. But let me just finish by flagging some of the trends that I picked up. Definitions are a nightmare. And this is way beyond these 16 concepts. There are a lot of environmental issues at the moment where common definitions are just not developed, especially in the offshore context. And also, even though I showed some interlinkages between them, they're not as thoroughly mapped and described as they could be and need some more work. Also, as I've pointed out, most concepts were developed on land and some are newer than others, so some will require much more testing. I gave some examples, and nature inclusive design and nature positive are newer concepts where that applies to. And I think more research and data collection are required for several concepts, especially cumulative impacts, ecological risk, ecosystem restoration, good environmental status, and nature positive. How different stakeholders, I think, view and use the different concepts within national exclusive economic zones will vary, again, depending on national legislative frameworks, policies and approaches and what's been done in the past. But I think finding ways of extending the use of these concepts to the high seas would also be ultimately very beneficial as well. So in conclusion, Len, let me just say that all 16 concepts, I think, should be considered more. I do, as you'll see from the report, I do flag ones I think probably worth pushing a bit quicker and a bit more urgency, but I think they do all need a bit more thought and all have some scope to be considered in maritime spatial planning going forward. For me, the key next steps, though, it's about really harmonizing definitions and terminology. Even if it starts in the offshore wind sector before more broadly in the marine environment in Europe, let's try and make sure we're at least all agreeing on what these concepts mean for us and how we use them. And then I think it's going to be really vital that in the very near future, we start providing examples of concepts in action, some like case studies in the offshore wind sector where you've seen some of these concepts used. So ecosystem restoration would be a good one, or the application of nature inclusive design. And in doing so, of course, going back to my earlier point, in these case studies, if we ensure that monitoring is done properly, then we can also demonstrate the results and the real impact of these efforts on biodiversity. And then, in a sense, you'll be proving the concept and ensuring that people are able to replicate what was done in an effective way as well. So there you go. That is a brief summary. I would just reiterate my point that this very much was a preliminary assessment. It was a top-line snapshot of where we're at the moment. And I hope very much, more than anything else, it stimulates some more discussion in this sector about what we need to do and can do going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, PJ, for this very comprehensive presentation. And as you said, I mean, all the other concepts are actually in the paper, so that please have a look at the paper, and we are happy then also to hear your feedback afterwards. So first of all, let me say that I do have to reinforce the fact that this is a discussion paper, so that being a discussion paper, actually the concept, the idea is of creating incrementally shedding some lights incrementally on some concepts. And as PJ was saying, of course, we need common definition. There is a need for research and data for testing, so that this is an ongoing process. So that this is why we call our papers discussion papers, as we actually foresee to continue this discussion in order then to reach actually other levels of knowledge on the concepts. PJ, before I open the floor actually for questions from the audience, we have actually three members of the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature that beyond the fact that they have selected these concepts, and so that actually those were discussed, and so that these different definitions and also different ways of implementing them came up as actually a challenge also in our work. They would like to react to this paper, and so that I would pass the floor. So first, let me introduce to you Odran Corcoran. He's the Marine Policy Officer at the WWF, the European Policy Office. And so Odran, first of all, I would like to ask you a reaction, but also as PJ was saying, there are issues on the application of the ecosystem-based approach, and the WWF has actually compiled an assessment of MSP, actually assessing the application of the ecosystem-based approach. So I would pass you the floor actually to react to this paper and to the idea and the need to find common definitions, but also based on the work that WWF is actually doing in assessing the maritime and spatial plans at the European level. Please, Odran.
Thank you, Christina. First of all, it's fantastic to see such a product, and I thank RGI and Dr. Stephenson for this work and presentation. Reading the paper itself, it was good to see that it acknowledges that the cumulative impact of human activities, including the development of renewable energy infrastructure, places additional pressures on marine ecosystems, which are already being degraded by human pressures, a fact that needs to be addressed to meet the 30 by 30 targets of the Biodiversity Strategy. I will touch upon the question of MSP briefly, but with that being said, with what I said about the Biodiversity Strategy, it is also vital that the EU sets ambitious targets to fight climate change. And for us, that would include a 65% emissions reduction target for 2030, zero net emissions by 2040, and a target for carbon sinks. And the sustainable rollout of offshore renewable energy will play a key role in this. It does offer the world an amazing opportunity in clean energy, but there are two sides, as Dr. Stephenson mentioned. And so there is a need, for example, for Repower EU to be aligned to the Biodiversity Strategy. And this is where MSP comes in. I mean, the concept of the Precautionary Principle and ecosystem-based approach are two concepts that are set out under the EU's Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive as well. So WWF has done an assessment on the Baltic. That was their newest assessment so far. We published guidance on MSP last year, which has been used by various organizations so far as a template for that. And we have other assessments per sea region in the pipeline at the moment. So on the basis of the paper, I completely wholeheartedly agree with the aim of it, which is to foster a shared understanding between all stakeholders on the environmental challenges that exist and what solutions we as environmental organizations, wind industry and transmission system operators can come up with together. So this is a key function of the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. So I would touch upon two concepts briefly. So on ecosystem restoration. So I believe the paper can play a valuable role in this regard on communicating and providing guidance on this important holistic concept. Just to touch upon briefly in the previous presentation, that marine restoration was relatively recent. I mean, it depends on what you mean by marine restoration. Certainly active restoration is a relatively new concept. But passive restoration, which is like when you leave nature alone, for example, that is not a new concept. If you leave nature alone, it has the capacity to restore itself. And we've all seen that with marine protected areas across Europe, which have been established for the last few decades. So the concept of ecosystem restoration, it is highly relevant now, considering the publication of the EU's nature restoration law last week. And it was fantastic to see the coalition publicly support an enforceable and binding restoration target of at least 15% of European sea basins through passive and restoration measures. And so, as I mentioned, passive restoration measures includes the removal of human pressures. So it's important to also state in relation to the concept of ecosystem restoration mentioned in the paper that the definition of nature restoration is now included in the EU's nature restoration law proposal. So marine habitats and species that need to be stored and protected, especially strictly protected areas, will require passive restoration, aka removal or reduction in human pressures and their impacts. So in the paper, he spoke about the idea of creating artificial reefs or substrates via renewable energy infrastructure, as mentioned for certain species and habitats. When it comes to ecological restoration, but that could be considered, in my view, on a case-by-case basis as active restoration, perhaps. But it is difficult to argue that it counts as passive restoration, even if you could call it a nature-based solution. But it is an interesting concept, and that it has merit alongside the concept of nature-inclusive designs, certainly. So my final concept I will touch upon. So I'll speak about conservation, particularly in the context of marine protected areas or MPAs. So the effective conservation of MPAs will be important, as these are critical areas of biodiversity significance with highly vulnerable species and habitats. So these species and habitats are, you could say, are humanity's natural ally, often in the fight against climate change. Some such as seagrass meadows, for example, and coastal wetlands store carbon at rates up to 4 times more than mature tropical rainforests. But many of these habitats, you could say, are endangered or threatened. So 81% of habitats in EU are in poor status due to the combined impact of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, which is why the Biodiversity Strategy targets of legally and effectively protecting at least 30% of the UC, with at least 1/3 strictly protected, is so highly important. So in this context, I have to emphasize that regarding these highly sensitive species and habitats, there is a high ecological risk to environmental stressors, even if there is additional action to compensate said impacts. So if you interfere with areas and diminish nature's way of sequestering and removing carbon to make room for renewable energy infrastructure, even, it is counterintuitive from the perspective of fighting climate change, as there's a loss in nature's capacity to help us fight climate change, and thus it is humanity's loss also. So therefore, it's important that MPAs are effectively managed and protected. So it is a significant problem in Europe in that regard, as a lot of them only exist on paper. So recent studies have shown that only 12% of the sea is covered by MPAs, and only 1.8% of that are those with a management plan. So it is a huge concern. But just to get back briefly to the paper, so we strongly welcome WWF's proposal for the inclusion of the IUCN guidelines and categories, setting out said categories of protected areas and the appropriate activities that should go along with them. So it's a very welcome addition to the paper, especially as the previous presentation stated by Dr. Stephenson. It is highly relevant, as 93% of Europe's marine area faces multiple pressures. And so this guidance is very, very important and relevant. So to conclude, I emphasize that all the concepts in the paper are interlinked. And for example, all the concepts are highly relevant towards achieving good environmental status. A key concept listed and a key environmental objective of EU environmental law, specifically the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So I thank RGI for giving WWF the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to engaging more with our coalition partners on how to apply and operationalize the concepts in the paper to help reach both our climate and biodiversity targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Audron. And yes, I mean, there are interlinkages between these concepts that have been presented in the discussion paper, but as you were saying, there are even more. So that this is why we will need, I mean, of course, to continue this conversation and actually to be able, I mean, to be even more comprehensive than in this first step. PJ, do you want to comment on Audron inputs to the discussion paper?
No, not directly. I took his point. I also take his point very clearly, and he's right, especially about restoration. And I think there's a common myth that like conservation and management of resources is new and was kind of invented by Europeans and North Americans and their NGOs and governments. But of course, local people have been managing their resources sustainably in so many environments for millennia, and of course that includes local fisheries and so forth as well in many cases, and that's also true that restoration, if you look at it, it's true, and perhaps that doesn't come out enough in some of what I said, but it's true, restoration isn't just about physically restoring, but it's also about just leaving things alone so that they're allowed to grow back as they were. So I totally take the point there, Adrian, and I'm sorry if I gave a false impression of that, but no, I appreciate his comments. And the importance of MPAs, I think that's a given. And maybe just mentioning that, I saw a question in the chat about sort of go-to areas. And of course, a lot of our discussion about marine spatial planning and then where do MPAs fit in and so forth. I mean, this kind of goes back to the, a lot of the planning needs to revolve around, okay, what are the no-go areas? What are the really sensitive areas that we really shouldn't be we should be avoiding, to use the mitigation hierarchy terminology. And then the sort of go-to areas, it's true. I mean, some parts of our oceans perhaps are more, would be more amenable to development of offshore wind farms with the minimal of impact. So, but to me, that's all an integral part of spatial planning, is to prioritize where can we develop and where can we not, and what are the different uses of those parts of the ocean. Over.
Thank you very much, PJ. And yeah, with regards to the restoration, as Odran was actually mentioning, in the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, we actually released, before the nature restoration law was released, a statement, so that we do have, as transmission system operator, NGOs, and wind industry, we came up with the common messages, so that this 15% of legally binding restoration being made of active and passive restoration measures, as Rodran was saying, and in the chat you will find the statement that we came up with. And I have to say that, of course, I do fully support your statement, PJ, saying that trying to avoid damage is what we need to do in first place. So this is also what we do, so that restoration is a key concept, but of course, I mean, the one of conservation and the work that we are also doing in collecting and actually stimulating innovative practices that actually would protect before going to restore, it's key. So thank you very much, Odran. And now I will ask to Julian Engelbert. He's a special planning advisor at Amprion. Amprion is one of the 4 German TSOs. Julian, so I would like to ask you again a reaction to the waiver, being also Amprion part of the coalition, and what is the perspective of a transmission system operator? Because we are talking here about renewable infrastructure. Of course, we know that this implies a connecting grid, so that this implies an undersea cable, a station on land, and reinforcement also on land that are needed in order to integrate offshore. So what's the perspective from a TSO?
Hi there, and first of all, I would like to echo Audran. Thank you, RGI, and thank you, PJ, for the common work on the paper. As a German offshore TSO, we work in a highly dynamic context at the moment, especially the national short-term goal of 30 gigawatt by 2030 is highly ambitious. We will do everything to reach this goal, but it won't be easy to achieve. Looking at the time after 2030, the character of the challenges we face is going to change. There will still be time pressure, as there is always time pressure everywhere, but there will also be growing technical complexity of our projects as the European offshore grid will emerge, at least in the North Sea and the Baltic. What I want to point out is the challenge is large enough, complexity is already high enough in context with the task to reach climate neutrality fast. So what all actors, and that explicitly means us as a TSO too, should avoid is to make things even more complex by creating friction, by brooding too long, or even by quarreling, because this will unavoidably lead to delay. Does all this go together with the aim of reaching the highest possible standard regarding marine ecosystems? I'm convinced it does, if it is done in the right way. And I think that's why we are here today. Defining key environmental concepts may, PJ, be a nightmare, but it is not an art. It is about science, as you said. It's about biology, ecology. It is about engineering too. It is about studies and data. So it is a field in which we clearly can aim at a common understanding. We can aim. We won't be able to reach it in every point, but we can aim at a common understanding on the basis of evidence, of discussion, and reason. And of course, on the basis of learning, because as we've heard from PJ, we still learn even about concepts that are already known and that may already be part of statutory law, like the ecosystem-based approach. That's the only way. What we already have and what we need further on are good craftsmen and good craftswomen at companies, at authorities, at NGOs too, who know their business and who come together with the will to create something viable for a nature-friendly offshore expansion. I think the paper we're talking about today is an important step. Surely not the last one, not the first one too, I hope. It is somewhere in between. And it can serve as a foundation for our common work in the Offshore Coalition, or perhaps beyond, why not? And I think PJ's idea of creating case studies would be a good next step. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. So first of all, PJ, I ask to you if you would like to comment on Julian's input.
No, thanks, Julian. I appreciate the feedback, especially on the case studies, because I know, and when you say something's complicated, I think at the moment in a lot of sectors, way beyond just offshore wind, way beyond marine in general, there's a lot of resistance. People are looking at the moment for easy solutions for biodiversity. I think biodiversity is going up on the political agenda. As we just saw last week in Nairobi, they're still really struggling to come up with agreement as they struggled for climate, but it's catching up in terms of urgency. But people are getting frustrated that there's no easy solution. And I still get businesses in lots of sectors coming and saying, but I want to know the one metric that I can measure that shows my biodiversity performance, how it's doing. But I think we all have to come to an understanding biodiversity is complicated. I mean, climate's pretty complicated, but in some respects, emissions and how their then effect on our climate and what's that effect that's having on us in the environment are relatively clear now. But biodiversity is complex. I always say it's everything from bacteria to blue whales, everything in between. It's all the interactions. Of course, it's species, habitats, and ecosystems, and the services they provide people. And it is true, in spite of years of ecological studies, in spite of all the efforts out there of our best scientists, there are still things we don't understand. And I think we have to learn to live in an environment where we still don't completely understand, but we also have to stop us using that as an excuse for not doing anything. We can't have paralysis because we're like, well, we don't totally understand yet. So
absolutely.
Well, on one hand, I'm saying, and I agree with you that you're reiterating my point about more data, but we shouldn't stop us acting. So we do know how to do some basic restoration. We do know what it means to at least try the ecosystem approach. So let me just be clear. Nothing I'm suggesting says that you shouldn't still be trying, but I would just say what I think would be useful is make some of those efforts a little bit more structured so they become in themselves almost like mini experiments so that you really carefully monitor progress, what you did and what it led to. Because then if you prove the concept and say, we applied that here and we had this impact and we've seen these fish stock improves or these corals revived, then that's going to stimulate. That will be the best stimulus, better than any EU policy that will motivate other people to do the same. So that would just be when I talk about more information, it's not to stop us acting, but it's just to inform so we know what we're doing is working.
Thank you very much, PJ, and thank you very much, Julian. So when it comes to, efforts that's more structured efforts that's aim to prove, the concepts that we're talking about, actually, this is something that we have as an ambition, but also as actually a commitment in the Offshore Energy Nature Coalition, because this is something that's it's moving and actually moving at the same time in between definition and concept, but to the implementation side that actually, so that this is what we aim at doing in identifying case studies, analyzing these case studies in order actually to prove the concept that we are showcasing in the discussion paper. And this is a very good, thank you very much, Julian. So this is also a very good way actually to introduce our last member of the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature is Mattia Cecchinato, is the Offshore and Sustainability Senior Advisor at Wind Europe. Mattia, as I'm asking to all a reaction to the paper, and also PJ mentioned about the nature positive approaches, and so these are actually approaches that some of the wind developers are already including in their commitments by 2030. So I pass the floor to you, so if you can react to the paper and the work that we have been doing together, but also the commitments that many wind developers have by 2030 to actually create a net positive biodiversity effect. Thanks.
Many thanks, Christina. Well, thanks also to RDI, of course, for procuring this study and for PJ for doing it and presenting it today. I think it's great to have. I was very happy to read this paper. Actually, it's one of the first deliverables we proposed in OCEAN, in the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, as since the very first moment that we sat around, we saw like how complicated and how vast was just the defining and understanding what the other were talking about. So I think this paper is very, very useful to indeed frame the big variety of concepts that we have out there from different institutions, bodies, researchers, and I guess it's the first challenge we met at in Ocean was like to stick to one body for various definition, because we wanted to avoid having to rely on a patchwork of concepts, and actually this is where we stand today. And I guess this is one of the outcomes that we can see also from this paper, because the more complicated are things, the harder are to explain to policymakers in the end, that are those that actually needs to get these concepts. I think the message is quite clear, and I fully support it. There is still not enough evidence and understanding, and I will maybe spend some words on regarding maritime ecosystem. It's true, the understanding we have is much more kind of understood on the terrestrial ecosystems, urban and rural, and we're now seeing translating these concepts on the offshore, on the maritime environment, and there might be some uncertainty on how to do it. I guess we still need a clear evaluation framework for the maritime environment, especially when we talk about nature-based solution. Actually, I think this is a very interesting concept that indeed started in urban ecosystems, is now expanding to rural. Rural is still not very well present, let's say, on the maritime side. And I was lucky to see actually this term and all the work made by the Commission starting when I was there. And indeed, there was a lot of work to understand how to assess and evaluate ecosystem services, how to understand the relationship, the interaction, and most importantly, how to evaluate, like how to manage to compare different impacts, but also then like try to quantify them in terms of extent, but also in terms of economic and social, let's say, impacts. That also this is quite new, especially in the maritime environment. I guess, well, the political momentum is strong, and we could rely on that to kind of put also pressure to these very same policymakers to have scientists to kind of get together and develop an assessment framework and give themselves actually the tools to best understand the environment. I guess in this context, in where we work today, the European Commission, of course, might have a very important role, but also the UN and any other environmental agency. And indeed, I guess I repeat, I very much welcome this report, because I guess that could really help our advocacy activities and at Oceans, and kind of make policymakers understand that we need to act now. And as we are allocating more financing from the wind energy sector, and for actually developing and installing turbines, that we also must follow with the same political attention on all these impacts, all these terms, and how to make this better. Of course, now it seems that all is all bad, but I guess the understanding is growing. We can see it every day. We're still not there, but we also must see the positive on this side. And indeed, that's why I guess we start having the first offshore wind companies coming with commitments such as having wind farm with net positive impacts by 2030. I guess also here, at the moment, it's a commitment indeed, and I'm pretty sure that the work that we're doing here in Ocean also had this role, let's say, in having this something movement at this level. But of course, this is only the beginning. I mean, it's once you have your target, then the work starts, and I guess this is a good sign from the industry, because they do have a lot of knowledge of the maritime environment. They do have their own research institutes and scientists looking at this solution. So if we are all there together with other research, public and private institutes, NGOs, and governments. I guess this is a win-win for everybody. So thank you very much again. And well, I hope this is just the beginning, so we will work together again soon.
Thank you, Mattia. PJ, I ask you if you want to comment to Mattia's input, and then
sure. No, I appreciate the comments, and I hear him about the need for a clear evaluation framework, especially of nature-based solutions and these other elements too. I think that's very true, and I think that that could be part of these case studies going forward. Is not only to monitor them well, but come up with a framework so you can monitor the same way across different initiatives as well. I also agree with him about the political momentum, and I think he's right. There's a role here for a range of different international organizations. I think, I was asked to think specifically in the Europe context, and I think it's without a doubt Europe is leading, as I said in my presentation, on the uptake of offshore wind. But I think going forward, this does need to become a global concern. I think the lessons that we're learning and sharing need to definitely go beyond Europe. I mean, Canada and US, certainly the US starting to pick up on use of offshore wind, but also have quite strong marine monitoring programs. And of course, Australia is the real hub of marine learning. Some of my colleagues in places like Scotland or Germany might disagree with me, but there's also a big hub of marine science and biodiversity monitoring in places like Australia too. So I think we need to, make this more of a global effort too, even though Europe is a hub. And I think, what we're learning from Europe can definitely help these other countries that have nascent offshore wind energy programs as well. So I think we need to keep that in mind. But I think, the EU definitely seems to, with its policies and its directives and its proposed new law and so forth, seems to be really taking a lead, which is nice to see.
Thank you very much, PJ. And so I see that in the chat, actually, so Danuta Kneipp from 50 Hertz, she rightly reminds us that actually in the ocean we are collecting practices, so that this is not just an ambition of the one of actually testing some concepts, but we are also already collecting those practices, so that we want also to become a platform. Actually, there is fragmented information about what has worked or not what has worked, so that we want also to play the role of being a platform for this. So I would ask all the participants to turn the video on, to name themselves with their name, surname, and organization, and to raise their hands in case of questions. Before we do that, so that I will start maybe with one of my questions, PJ. So when it comes to standardization, so of course it will be much easier if those concepts could be standards, right? So it's very complex, but it would be, at least this is what our wish is, because we have also a sea basin approach, so that it goes beyond the member states, so that having actually standards that also allows comparison, I mean, it would be ideal. When it comes to cumulative impact assessments, so you have showed, for instance, HELCOM and all the correlation between the pressures actually and the activities, but there are many more methods that are available. How likely possible is a standardization of actually methods for the cumulative impact assessments?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a good point. I think it'll probably have to be done in the context of a specific governance body, if you like. So what I find generally, standardization, if you're going to use the approach, is there has to be a community that's doing that. And I think the idea of immediately going to the global level and coming up with a global standard is quite difficult to do. I mean, IUCN have done it with nature-based solutions, but they were at the forefront of the development of the idea, but it's pretty hard. I mean, even now we're seeing discussions of a standard for what biodiversity means, a standard for what restoration means. There are discussions going on in different communities. So I think it needs to be done by a community. So it might just be that, Christina, people will think you've set me up this question. I must just point out, you didn't tell me you were going to ask me that. So I would say that it might just be that the community, now whether it's through the likes of Ocean, or other means, but maybe trying to find a standard that's used more widely in Europe for that might be a starting point. Now, I mention it now that you mentioned before also the earlier report I did for RGI on what we need to monitor around offshore wind farms if we're going to, and the associated power cables and grid infrastructure. What do we need to monitor? And one of the challenges I found there was this lack of common approach across sea basins, across countries. So while you had the overarching umbrella of different EU directives and policies, then you had the different commissions, especially OSPAR and HELCOM for the Baltic and the Northeast Atlantic, having different biodiversity indicators, different approaches for collecting data. And then, of course, you got national legislation. And so then if you're looking at the moment, even what different countries are proposing for monitoring, you get very different approaches from what, say, the Germans are doing compared to maybe the Belgians, or compared, I was going to say the UK. Am I allowed to mention the UK anymore? But yes, they're still part of the Northeast Atlantic, if not the EU. But yet, I mean, some of these countries, especially Germany and the UK, actually have very strong guidelines and standards for monitoring. But my point there, but they're not harmonized with each other. So I think if you're looking for a common mechanism for cumulative impact assessment, then I think you need to get something that goes beyond any one or two countries or any one or two sea basins if it's going to work. And so, and again, I don't know, that's more your domain than mine, but I would think that would be something to consider for you and your partners.
Yes, thank you very much. And that was a little bit of out of a curiosity, because of course, I mean, beyond moderating, I'm also very interested, of course, in the topic. So that's, and yes, I mean, so we are also exploring, I mean, actually the topic of the centralization of data collection. We are looking at it at the moment more at a national level, so that we are also looking into how there is a collection at the national level that actually allows the monitoring. And Belgium is one of the examples that actually in the last 15 years have been collecting data, and I'm sure that here also my colleagues and also Mattia and Roland can elaborate more on this. But of course, this requires then a collaboration that goes beyond, I mean, just one member state, but actually should bring together more member states, and this is crucial. But this is a recurring questions of that sometimes it's a simplified statement of the one we should have standardized cumulative impact assessment, but of course we understand the complexity of it and of this behind it. So
just to add, it's if I may, and the other point linking to the, I mean, there's one thing is doing the assessments, but then it's sharing the information, and that's the thing about cumulative impact assessments. At the moment, just like you'll get a fantastic environmental impact assessment for a particular offshore wind project, but then it's not always shared. Some increasingly, I did, for work I've done, I did find a few more that are publicly available. There's a lot of information that is still held by the people that did those impact assessments, kept in the companies or the consultancies, just not shared. And we're never going to get a complete understanding of cumulative impacts if we keep collecting data like that. So sharing is important. Also in that other paper I did for you guys, we talked about, you know, okay, there are common platforms such as Eurobis, which also feeds into global platforms, just as an example. But we also need to find ways of the information, the data, and the learning from that. We need to structure and standardize the way we share it, because otherwise we're also not going to advance.
Yes, absolutely. We have always been actually investigating more EMODnet, so at the European level, and in the recent MSP stakeholder conference that the Commission held in Brest, they actually announced that 4 member states have actually uploaded their data for the MSP actually on the platform, so that the idea of having a centralized, it is I mean, a big ambition, but even at the European level, I mean, this would be the best way to overcome this problem. So I have another couple of questions, but here let me see if there is anyone who raised their hand. Don't be shy, of course. And so I see. Okay, let me Go ahead. And this is, PJ, this is a question actually for you, but actually this is a question I would say for all the participants, because I think that's, so we have already partially addressed this problem now in this discussion. So there is, of course, a very important implementation of the precautionary principle. I mean, of course, we do agree this is key, and so the decision has to be made on scientific knowledge, on evidence, and but at the same time, we are also, as in the context I was anticipating, we are also experiencing actually an urgency and the need actually to boost the renewable and the grid infrastructure in order to respond to all the problems that we have seen at the beginning. So PJ, so this goes beyond, of course, the discussion paper, and this is open actually to all the participants, because how do we combine these two needs? I mean, the one of course of preserving the marine environment, of implementing precautionary principles, but also the one of actually boosting and accelerating the needed infrastructure, the renewable infrastructure at the moment.
Well, maybe I'll start, but I'm also keen to hear from the guys who responded to my
Sure.
presentation too, because again, you guys are more specialized in this subject. But so I said, so I mean, we do have that challenge at the moment, and I think it's been highlighted probably more than anything by the war in Ukraine, because suddenly now Europe has suddenly had a big kick in terms of suddenly people are understanding better than ever before where their energy is actually coming from. And I think probably some people were quite shocked to find how much of it was actually oil and gas, no matter whether it was from Russia or not. I think this huge dependency of so many European countries on oil and gas, like I say, wherever it's from, was a shock. But now there's this panic about has kind of given an extra kick to this need to find other sources of energy. But then, of course, you've got this issue, which so while renewable energy as a starter is obviously seen as incredibly useful. What slightly worries me, and I'm not sure I'm going to find a solution to you, but what I'm seeing though is slightly worrying, is that there's going to be even more pressure put on marine. And I don't know how many, again, to keep the European context, in the French election, for example, it was part of the election campaign. There was a big discussion about renewable energy, and Monsieur Macron actually made it very clear that he's very much for renewables, but they all have to be offshore. And that you're kind of hearing echoed in a lot of places in Europe, I think, at the moment. So although renewable energy is seen as important, it's increasingly getting pushed offshore for reasons of people who just voters who would rather not have a wind turbine near them for whatever reason. So you've got that pressure there. What I'm also seeing as a worrying trend is the sudden reemergence of nuclear. Because nuclear, of course, is a clean energy in the sense that it's not got the greenhouse gas emissions we have from oil and gas and so forth. But of course, it's got huge environmental risks, enormous environmental risks. And the dialogue I'm hearing now from so many European countries about how the default reaction to some of this oil and gas discussion because of the Russia-Ukraine war seems to have suddenly brought nuclear back front line again. So I think these are the conditions we're operating at a time when we're trying to make biodiversity seen as really, really important, where we're seeing vested interests really slow down those Nairobi discussions. And mean the discussions in Canada at the end of the year, which if people aren't following is when the Convention on Biological Diversity will decide its next set of goals for the years to come. People are still struggling. And of course we had that with climate, but people still can't let go of those vested interests. But somehow we've got to break through this and find a way that we can meet those energy needs and energy security, but at the same time, not completely throw biodiversity out. Because I think the only way we're really going to do that is to reinforce even more the fact that we're talking about planetary ecosystems and the fact we're as dependent on these ecosystems as the species and habitats as well. So it's trying to get a dialogue that links the environment as well to broader human welfare issues. And of course, there's the issue of food security, which is often due to the ecosystem services coming from the nature we need to preserve. It's not just about saving dolphins and fish and rare lobsters or whatever. It's also about ecosystem services provided to humans. Of course, we've also had with COVID, the reinforcement of the link between the environment and infectious diseases. And so there's this whole nexus between food security, environment, and health, as well as energy, that I think we need to be talking about. And again, sorry to complicate things even more with these interlinkages, but I think we've got to start talking about them more as an interlinked package. Otherwise, we're going to struggle, because otherwise people are going to just start, okay, we're going to build that wind farm because, well, we need it. We're going to build that another nuclear power station or restart a nuclear power station on the coast, regardless, because we've got to do something. And somehow we've got to get our priorities right. So sorry, that was a long rant because you touched on a big issue.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you very much, and thank you, I mean, for going beyond, I mean, the discussion paper, because this is, I mean, of course, I mean, it's beyond the concepts, but it's also, of course, embedded into a context, so that this is the context of the paper. So I would like to ask. So before, I think that Patrick Rockford, I saw before, might have. Raise his hand. I don't know, Patrick, if I saw wrong, I mean, or just open your mic in case. Okay, so then we go to Roland Lesch's colleague from RGI.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot, PJ, for this very nice, comprehensive presentation. I'll go back to the restoration measures, and I'd like to pick a line that you mentioned in your presentation about that restoring marine habitats. Sometimes it takes a long time. And I'd like to ask you, on average, what would be this time frame, having in mind the restoration law that has binding targets by 2030? Are we gonna be able to deliver and successfully reach that kind of deadline? Or what is your perspective on that? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And again, it depends. This all goes back to definitions. What do you mean by restoration? Now, the key debate about restoration is, what are you restoring? What was the initial state you're trying to get back? Because of course, a lot of our ecosystems in the oceans as well as on land have been influenced and changed by people for a long time anyway. So what is the state you're trying to restore? So that's the first question that needs to be established. And again, that needs to be basically done, framed in the context of the goal. And this is where you need to talk. I mean, in any given ocean basin or whatever, it's about the key stakeholders coming together and deciding what it means to them, especially if we're talking about ecosystem services, not just the species and habitats in there. So first of all, it's about getting a clear understanding of what do we want? What do we want to set as a goal? What makes sense? And of course, because half the time anyway, we don't know what was there beyond a certain distance into the past anyway. So it has to be sensible, but it has to meet user needs. But then you're right, then though it is a challenge, because, and again, I can't quickly find but to hand, but certainly in some of the other work I've done, we've been looking at this as well. And again, it depends immensely on the habitats and the level of degradation that's been experienced. I mean, some seagrass beds, you can see the impacts if they're left to their own devices. It can take decades to be restored to normality if you just leave them to revive themselves. Coral reefs, again, I mean, restoration, I mean, you can set up artificial reefs. People now even go underwater and even plant corals and try and rebuild physically the reefs. But to get the whole thriving ecosystem with all the fish and the crustacea and the microorganisms that there were before, that's going to take a long time. And that there have been studies done, especially on reefs, and especially probably nearer the Australian part of the world, which again, the factors affecting the speed of restoration are influenced by a lot of things. And that can even include the currents. If you're trying to restore an area where the ocean currents aren't in favor of you, then it's very difficult. But if you have an ocean current that's bringing larvae of different organisms or largely sedentary organisms in the current towards where you are, it's going to be quicker than if you like, upstream from the problem. And there are other factors linked to that too, in terms of, how the climate's changing and everything else. So it's hard to put a figure on it, but it usually is long term. What I have said in some of my own papers and from lessons I've had from looking at conservation portfolios more broadly of conservation NGOs, what we have said is generally to have an impact, that means for actions to lead to a positive change, a conservation impact, to have a positive change on biodiversity, it usually takes at least a decade. So it usually takes at least 10 years. And so this, of course, is the challenge. And that's why conservation as a whole is a challenge, because it does, by definition, have to be a long-term process. But as we all know, political processes and government cycles are a lot shorter. They vary, but a political time frame, 3 to 5 years maybe. But in fact, conservation timeline, we should be talking in decades. So that is part of the challenge. But then again, so I go back to the fact that means I would suggest the planning needs to be around long-term restoration goals, but you'll need to map out the steps to get there. So find some intermediary results. Okay, if we're going to have full restoration of this ecosystem, maybe it's in 20 years. What would we expect to see after the first 2 years? What might we expect to see after the next 2 years? And I think by breaking it down into what you can start to see, that will be the first thing. And again, referring to what Odrin mentioned earlier too, part of restoration is removing pressures. So also, if you're monitoring the pressures, you can also start to see, well, actually, we've seen a reduction in this pressure as well. And that can happen more rapidly than a change in the state of biodiversity. And so if you set milestones towards your long-term goals, and if you're monitoring actions and responses and the pressures as well as the state of biodiversity, you probably can start to show progress in restoration in a shorter time frame. Over.
Thank you very much, PJ. Yeah, this is the discussion that is just started about restoration, so that we also have many more questions in the ocean that came with our statement, and we will be continuing the discussion and collaboration on these. So I'm concerned about time. We have a few minutes left, so I would ask the audience if there is any question. Please raise your hands. Otherwise, so I have to thank you very much, PJ, for this discussion paper that has been really useful also on the work and the collaboration of such a diverse group of stakeholders, so that for us, this is a starting point, as we said. Thank you very much, and thank you very much also for the work that you have done on the review of the biodiversity monitoring study, because those are all important pieces that we need actually in order to move towards a joint solutions. So this is the kind of understanding that we need at the base of our collaboration. I would like to thank very much also the members of the ocean that have participated and contributed with their inputs. And I would like also to thank the RGI, Offshore Coalition and Energy Nature team that actually organized this webinar. So the recording will be available. You will receive a link, and it will be also available at our website along with the presentation and along with the discussion paper. So enjoy the reading, and I thank you all, and I wish you all a very nice afternoon.